Hello again, my name is Phil, I'm from toothsoup.com, and this is a slightly belated review of Borderlands 2. I've had a few real life goings on since my last video, so it's taken me a little longer to put in the hours necessary to get to grips with the game. But in the past week, a few friends and I have been sprinting across the wastelands of Pandora on a fairly regular basis, and we've gotten far enough into the campaign that I feel I can comfortably review it. Borderlands 2, developed by Gearbox, is unsurprisingly the sequel to Borderlands, which is the first real successful attempt at transposing a Diablo-style action RPG into first-person shooter territory, a loot-em-up, so to speak. That first in the series was praised for its cel-shaded graphics and successful integration of item mechanics and FPS environments, as well as a relatively solid character-driven story set in the same sort of space western universe that would be at least a first cousin to Joss Whedon's Firefly. It's good to know then that those foundations have remained strong. The cel shading is still very much evident, and even though the game is again running on a modified Unreal 3 engine, it seems to have been refined in the intervening years, resulting in environments and enemies that look artistically on par with other big name engines such as Skyrim.
Sir.
Of course, it wouldn't be a shoot 'em up if there weren't guns, and they spew forth from greenlit containers in a number of variations as near to infinite as you're ever likely to find. The weapon designs are a lot more varied and visually exciting this time around, with holographic crosshairs, mounted video cameras, heat exhausts and electric currents running in and around the barrels. I did want to discuss a couple of issues related to weapons and items in general, the first being something that the Penny Arcade webcomic has already touched on. That is, that the game does sometimes feel like an arrow comparison simulator. Especially at the early stages of the game, before you start filtering for rare or unique guns, it can seem like every second thing you pick up needs to be scrutinized for whether it offers a slight advantage over your current weapon. It may take a little while, but once you figure out which type of guns you prefer and what kind of stats you prioritize, making the decision to use or lose is usually pretty quick. The other gripe I had was that in multiplayer I really would have preferred to see Gearbox take the instance item approach that other loot-based games, such as Torchlight 2, have done recently. At the moment, loot is shared between a party, which sucks because no matter how friendly your group is, there's always a conflict between shooting the bad guy and picking up that rare gun before your mate does. If they had instead made it so that every player had their individual loot table when containers were opened, it would encourage a lot more sharing, and less greed, especially in multiplayer matches that don't involve friends you can legitimately threaten. Other than those two nitpicks though, the guns in the game act as you would expect, although they have certainly tried to liven up the mechanics a bit. One notable reworking in the roster of manufacturers is the TDL brand, which is now apparently so cheap that rather than reloading, you pitch the gun at the enemy like a grenade before digitally warping in a new one into your waiting hands. The only brand new manufacturer isn't really one at all, with the bandit weapons now being able to be wielded by players in all their junkyard glory. The inventory system hasn't changed a whole lot, and suffers from inheriting the cross-platform curse, ending up a whole lot clunkier than it could have been if it were designed for people who can use a mouse to move things between slots. But in general, the UI does its job well, and there's a nice touch in multiplayer where the other player characters will actually show as looking at a holographic display when they're accessing their menu, so you know instantly when someone's updating their guns or spending skill points. Game environments aren't a whole lot larger than the original, although they are a lot more varied in both palette and geography. Players start in icy tundra before progressing through various different wastelands and grasslands, which makes a nice colour change from the endless brown of the first game. The location for quests can often be seen to be made up of a series of loosely connected areas, or even arenas, where enemies spawn. The level design encourages players to move about in order to use cover and get better angles on enemies. The AI also takes advantage of this, and it's not uncommon for them to climb up on boxes and jump around to better flank the player. I can't stress enough the difference that vertical movement makes to gunfights. All too often, looking around is confined to the horizontal plane in shooters, so to have AI that actively encourages players to look up and around at their environments is refreshing. It all results in combat that feels very dynamic. Multiplayer co-op was a significant part of the first Borderlands success, and the process of joining up with mates has been made even smoother and simpler in the second. Within about a minute of installing, my friends and I were in-game, making our way to the first quest objective. While inevitably you'll double up on who wants to play which of the four characters, they are highly customizable, with different skins and different heads, so you'll never feel like you're a clone. And of course, there are 3 different skill trees that each player can invest points in to differentiate their playstyle. Playing with friends ups the difficulty significantly, and makes the game a lot more satisfyingly challenging than the single player, which can feel a bit easy to skill spam sometimes. In single player mode, players that have lost all their health have a few seconds to try and get a kill, which will provide them with a second wind, regenerating their shields and giving a little bit of health back. In multiplayer, this mechanic is still in place, but characters can also be revived by other players by walking up to them and holding a button. With the increased difficulty, you're going to need this. The character-driven humour has made it safely through to the sequel, with the grating voice of Claptrap, a masochistic bot from the original, being the first to start snapping out one-liners in your comms unit. If I'm honest, I found the initial attempts at humour to be kind of annoying, but it does get better. As with all comedy, there are hits and there are misses, but overall I found myself grinning more often than not. Oh, and if you're a fan of pop culture references in games, you're going to find them in spades here. And not just subtle hints either. I've already seen Top Gun and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles having their own entire quest chains dedicated to them. The writers have done a really good job of sucking you in before letting you realise on your own which culture icon they're referring to, rather than smashing you over the head with their cleverness. This won't be a surprise to those who know the work of the main writer, Anthony Birch of Hey Ash What You Playin' fame. The actual story is well written also, with the player characters from the original returning as important figures in the second. I won't give anything away, but the relationship between Lilith and Roland is particularly touching to learn about through recordings and their interaction with each other. There are even some attempts at tackling what might be considered serious issues, such as body image, through the Ellie questline. Ellie is a caricatured behemoth of a woman, but rather than take the easy way out with fat jokes, the writers have given Ellie self-confidence, pride, and made her a kick-ass, accomplished mechanic. Each questline involving these characters begins with the standard go here, fetch and do this, but usually ends with some kind of insight into the character and their motivations. Another example is Tiny Tina, whose bizarre request to go and fetch stuffed dolls for a tea party becomes slightly more meaningful and a little bit disturbing when the final tea party guest turns out to be a bandit who killed her parents. It just goes to prove that famous bit of writing advice by Kurt Vonnegut. Making characters want something, even if it's a glass of water, gives them life. And okay, in Borderlands, it's a small slice of life they're given, but it's a slice the writers easily could have foregone in favour of an easier path. The fact that they put in the work ought to be recognised, and the fact that they were able to slip in these little tidbits without spoiling the overall light-hearted nature of the game should be applauded. Ultimately though, Borderlands 2 is a game whose prime objective is fun. From the cel-shaded art, to the voice acting, to the storyline, to the arcade-style vehicle combat and over-the-top enemies, this is a game about letting go and having a blast. If you're looking for an FPS with a difference and a fairly well-pitched sense of humour, this is the game for you. It's available in stores or online through Steam in a single unit for US $69.99 or a 4-pack for US $209.99, which works out at around US $52 each. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.